The pre-dawn darkness of Atlanta hung heavy with humidity as Sarah Collins adjusted Max's tactical harness one final time. The Belgian Malinois sat perfectly still, his amber eyes locked on hers, reading every micro-expression on her face. 6 years together had made them more than partners. They were extensions of each other, a single unit operating with the precision of a Swiss watch. "Ready, boy," Sarah whispered, running her hand along Max's sleek black and tan coat. His ears perked forward in response, a low rumble of anticipation building in his chest. The warehouse district sprawled before them like a concrete graveyard, abandoned buildings casting long shadows under the flickering streetlights. Intelligence suggested this particular structure housed a drug processing operation, significant quantities of fentanyl moving through the port and into the city's veins. Sarah's team had been tracking the organization for 3 months, and tonight they finally had enough for a warrant. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. "K9 unit, you're clear for approach. Entry team is 30 seconds behind you." Sarah moved forward in a low crouch, Max flowing silently beside her like liquid shadow. Her Glock 19 felt reassuringly solid in her right hand, while her left maintained contact with Max's lead. The weight of her ballistic vest pressed against her chest as her heart rate climbed, not from fear, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that came before every operation. The warehouse door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light bleeding into the darkness. Sarah signaled Max to halt, then pressed herself against the corrugated metal wall. She could hear voices inside, angry, argumentative Spanish punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the clink of glass. "Max, Zoic," she commanded softly. "Search." The Malinois' entire demeanor shifted. His nose went to work, drawing in deep samples of air, processing thousands of scent particles that were invisible to human perception. Within seconds, his body tensed. The alert Sarah had been waiting for, drugs, definitely drugs, and close. She keyed her radio. "K9 to command. Positive alert. Multiple subjects inside. Preparing for—" The door exploded outward. Sarah threw herself sideways as a Hispanic male in his 20s burst through the opening, wild-eyed and clearly high on his own product. He didn't see her in the shadows, but Max did. The dog launched forward with terrifying speed, 70 pounds of trained muscle and instinct. His jaws clamped onto the suspect's forearm before the man could take 3 steps. "Police! Don't move!" Sarah shouted, weapon trained on the struggling pair. "Max, eat! Out!" The dog released immediately but maintained his aggressive stance, teeth bared, ready to re-engage on command. The suspect collapsed to the pavement, crying out in pain and fear as Sarah moved in with flex cuffs. Behind her, the entry team flooded through the door, tactical officers in black gear moving with choreographed efficiency. Flashbangs detonated inside with sequential thunderclaps that lit up the night. Shouts of "Police!" and "Get down!" echoed through the warehouse. Sarah secured her prisoner and handed him off to a uniformed officer before following Max back toward the entrance. The Malinois was already working, nose scanning the air, body language telling her there was more to find. She trusted his nose more than any technology the department could afford. Inside, the warehouse was organized chaos. 6 suspects lay prone on the concrete floor, hands behind their heads, while officers moved through stacks of cardboard boxes and plastic-wrapped pallets. In the center of the space, a makeshift lab setup gleamed under industrial lights. Beakers, burners, and bags of white powder arranged on folding tables like some nightmare science fair. "Sarah," Morrison appeared at her elbow, his weathered face grim. "Good work on the runner. Max earned his kibble tonight." "He always does, Lieutenant." Sarah scratched behind Max's ears, feeling the dog's elevated heart rate slowly settling. "What's the count?" 7 suspects, approximately 40 kilos of fentanyl in various stages of processing, and enough precursor chemicals to supply half the eastern seaboard. Morrison glanced at his tablet. "We also found something else, documents, ledgers. This wasn't just a processing site, it was an accounting hub." Sarah's eyebrows rose. Someone kept records. Someone got sloppy, and that someone is going to help us roll up this entire organization. Morrison's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowned, then looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Briefing in 30 minutes. And Sarah, we've got help coming in. Federal task force is taking an interest. The words sent a small chill down her spine. Federal involvement meant the case was bigger than they'd thought. It also meant outside investigators, turf battles, and the inevitable clash of egos that came when agencies overlapped. Back at the precinct, Sarah took Max to their designated K9 area, a corner of the building outfitted with water bowls, a raised platform bed, and storage for equipment. She removed his harness and camera, then spent 10 minutes running through their post-operation routine. Check paws for injuries, examine teeth and gums, provide water and a high-value treat. Most importantly, decompress together in silence. Max curled up on his bed, chin resting on crossed paws, watching Sarah with those intelligent amber eyes. She knew what he was thinking, or at least, she liked to imagine she did. Good work tonight. We kept each other safe. We always do. Love you, Bob, she murmured, giving him a final pat before heading to the briefing room. The space was already crowded when she arrived. Detectives hunched over laptops. Uniformed officers compared notes, and crime scene techs scrolled through digital photos of the warehouse. The energy was electric, the kind that came after a successful operation when everyone felt like they'd made a real difference. Lieutenant Morrison stood at the front with a man Sarah had never seen before. Her breath caught. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite, strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that were an unusual shade of grey-blue. He wore dark jeans, a fitted black shirt under a leather jacket, and an air of quiet confidence that commanded the room without saying a word. A detective's shield hung from his belt next to a holstered Sig Sauer. "Listen up," Morrison called out, and the room settled. "I want to introduce Detective James Garrett. He's with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, and he'll be coordinating with us on the warehouse investigation. The evidence we recovered tonight suggests this operation ties into something much larger. International trafficking networks that we've been tracking for the better part of 2 years. James stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, with just a hint of a southern accent that suggested roots somewhere in the Carolinas. "Thank you, Lieutenant. What your team accomplished tonight was exceptional work. The warehouse seizure represents the largest fentanyl bust in Georgia this year. But more importantly, those documents you recovered are going to help us connect dots we've been struggling with for months." His eyes scanned the room, making brief contact with each officer until they landed on Sarah. For just a heartbeat longer than necessary, his gaze held hers. Something flickered in those grey-blue depths, recognition, interest, curiosity. Sarah felt heat creep up her neck and forced herself to maintain eye contact rather than look away like some rookie. "I'll need to interview the arresting officers individually," James continued, breaking the connection. "Lieutenant Morrison will coordinate schedules. We're looking at a complex network with multiple distribution hubs across the southeast. The people you arrested tonight are mid-level at best, but they're going to help us identify the real players." The briefing continued for another 20 minutes. Discussion of evidence protocols, chain of custody, and the legal framework for federal-state cooperation. Sarah tried to focus on Morrison's words, but she found her attention drifting back to James Garrett. There was something magnetic about him, a gravitational pull she couldn't quite explain. When the meeting broke up, she deliberately moved toward the exit, intending to return to Max and avoid any awkward interactions. But Morrison's voice stopped her. "Collins, hold up a second." She turned to find both Morrison and James approaching. Up close, the detective was even more striking. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes suggested someone who laughed often, despite the serious nature of his work, and there was an intensity in the way he looked at her that made Sarah's pulse quicken. Officer Collins was our K9 handler on tonight's operation, Morrison explained to James. She and Max were responsible for the initial alert and the apprehension of the runner. James extended his hand. Impressive work. I've worked with K9 units before, but that was textbook execution. Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested regular time at the range. Max deserves the credit. I just try to keep up. Humble, too. A slight smile played at the corner of James's mouth. I'd like to schedule an interview with you for tomorrow, if that works with your shift rotation. I want to walk through the approach sequence, what Max alerted on, any behavioral changes you observed in the suspects. Of course, whatever helps the investigation. Good. James pulled out a business card and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, and Sarah felt an electric jolt race up her arm. From the slight widening of his eyes, she suspected he felt it too. My cell's on there. If you think of anything else before our meeting, don't hesitate to call. Morrison's radio squawked, pulling his attention away. He moved toward the door, speaking urgently into the device, leaving Sarah and James alone in the emptying briefing room. So, James said, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets. 6 years with Max. 6 years next month, Sarah confirmed, surprised he'd retained that detail from the briefing. You've worked with K9 units before? In the Marines before I joined the Bureau. Combat tracker dogs in Afghanistan. Those animals saved my life more than once. There was a weight to his words, a depth of experience that Sarah recognized in other veterans she'd worked with. There's something about that bond, the trust between handler and dog. It's difficult to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It's everything, Sarah said simply. Max is my partner in every sense of the word. James nodded slowly, studying her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. I can tell. The way you moved together tonight, the non-verbal communication, that takes years to develop, and it takes the right person. Not everyone can do this work. No, Sarah agreed. Not everyone can. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was charged, alive with possibility and unspoken questions. Sarah found herself noticing details, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his shoulders filled out the leather jacket, the intelligence burning behind those unusual eyes. Well, James finally said, breaking the moment, I should let you get back to your partner. I'm sure Max is wondering where you disappeared to. Probably plotting an escape from his bed, Sarah said with a slight laugh. He gets restless after operations. Tomorrow then. Say 10 o'clock? 10 works. She turned to leave, acutely aware of his eyes following her movement. At the door, she glanced back and found him still watching, that enigmatic half-smile on his face. Sarah felt her heart stutter, then forced herself to keep walking. In the K9 area, Max raised his head as she entered, tail thumping against his bed in greeting. Sarah sank down next to him, running her fingers through his fur, while her mind replayed every moment of the conversation with James Garrett. This was dangerous territory. She dated before, a few relationships that had ended amicably when the demands of the job proved too much. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Max pressed his cold nose against her palm, grounding her in the present. She smiled and scratched his favorite spot behind his left ear. Just a briefing, boy, she told him. Nothing to worry about. But even as she said it, Sarah knew she was lying. Something had shifted tonight. A tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of her carefully ordered life. Detective James Garrett had walked into her world, and she had the unsettling feeling that nothing would ever be quite the same. She just didn't know how right she was, or how much that change would cost her. Sarah arrived at the precinct 15 minutes early for her interview with James, Max trotting obediently at her side. She'd told herself the extra care she'd taken with her appearance that morning, the carefully applied mascara, the lip gloss, the way she'd left her hair down instead of pulling it into its usual utilitarian ponytail, had nothing to do with the detective. But the flutter in her stomach when she spotted his unmarked sedan in the parking lot told a different story. The interview room smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. James was already there, spreading case files across the metal table, his jacket draped over the back of a chair. He looked up when she entered, and that same electric connection from the previous night sparked to life between them. "Officer Collins? Right on time." He gestured to the chair across from him. "And Max, of course. Does he sit in on all your meetings?" "He goes where I go," Sarah said, settling into the chair while Max positioned himself at her feet. "Unless it's somewhere dogs aren't allowed, and then he makes his displeasure very clear." James smiled, a real one this time, reaching his eyes and transforming his serious face into something warmer, more approachable. "I can imagine. My tracker in Afghanistan was the same way. Acted like we'd personally betrayed him if we had to leave him behind." The interview began professionally enough. James walked her through the warehouse approach, asking detailed questions about Max's behavior, the scent pattern, the suspect's demeanor. But as they talked, Sarah noticed the way the conversation kept drifting into more personal territory. Stories about her training with Max, James's time in the Marines, their mutual love of early morning runs when the city was still quiet. "So what brought you from the FBI to a local task force?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "Most federal agents I've met prefer to stay in their lane." James leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I got tired of chasing cases from behind a desk in Washington. The real work happens on the ground, with officers like you who know their city, who've built relationships in the community. The Bureau has resources, but local departments have something more valuable: institutional knowledge and trust." That's a surprisingly diplomatic answer for someone who could have just said, "Bureaucracy sucks." He laughed, a rich sound that sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest. "That too. I spent 3 years in the DC field office before I requested reassignment. Atlanta's crime landscape is complex. International trafficking, gang networks, white-collar crime all intersecting. It's exactly the kind of challenge I was looking for. And the fact that we have better weather than Washington, that's just a bonus." James's eyes held hers across the table, and Sarah felt the temperature in the room climb several degrees. "Though I'm finding there are other perks I hadn't anticipated." Before Sarah could respond, before she could even process the implications of that statement, the door burst open. A female officer in patrol blues strode in, pulling up short when she saw them. Sarah's heart sank. "Sarah!" Rebecca Collins's face lit up with a smile that Sarah knew was at least partly performance. Her younger sister had always been beautiful, petite, where Sarah was athletic, with delicate features and warm brown eyes that made her look younger than her 28 years. "Lieutenant Morrison said you were in here. I've been looking everywhere for—" Rebecca's words died as her gaze landed on James. Sarah watched in real time as her sister's expression shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, interest, calculation, and something that looked disturbingly like hunger. "Oh." Rebecca's voice dropped to a softer register, the one she used when she wanted to appear vulnerable or endearing. "I didn't realize you were in a meeting. I'm so sorry to interrupt." James stood, extending his hand with the same professional courtesy he'd shown Sarah. "No worries. We were just finishing up. I'm Detective James Garrett, FBI." "Rebecca Collins." Her sister shook his hand, holding the contact a beat too long. "Sarah's younger sister. Also with the Atlanta PD, though obviously I'm not as decorated as this one." The self-deprecating comment, delivered with a slight laugh, set Sarah's teeth on edge. Rebecca had been doing this since high school, positioning herself as the sweet, slightly uncertain sibling who needed protection and guidance, when in reality she was just as capable and significantly more manipulative. "I'm sure you're being modest," James said graciously, though Sarah noted he'd taken a subtle step back, putting distance between himself and Rebecca. "Were you part of the warehouse operation?" "No. I was on a different call that night, but I heard all about it." Rebecca's eyes flicked to Sarah, and there was something sharp in that glance, despite the smile on her face. "My sister's always getting the exciting assignments. Must be nice having Max to help stack up the wins." "Max is an asset," Sarah said evenly, recognizing the familiar pattern. Rebecca had always struggled with their father's decision to encourage Sarah into the K-9 unit after her initial patrol rotation. Their father, retired Atlanta PD himself, had recognized something in Sarah that aligned with the demanding work of handling police dogs. Rebecca had interpreted it as favoritism. But every assignment has its own challenges. "Of course." Rebecca turned her attention back to James. "Actually, Detective, I wanted to ask about the task force. Lieutenant Morrison mentioned you might be looking for additional officers to help with surveillance and coordination. I have experience with undercover work and—" "Rebecca." Sarah's voice came out sharper than intended. "The detective is in the middle of conducting interviews." "Right." "Sorry." But Rebecca didn't look sorry. She looked triumphant, as if she'd already accomplished what she came for. "Detective Garrett, if you need anything, background on the local crime scene, extra hands on surveillance, I'm available. Sarah has my contact information." "I'll keep that in mind," James said neutrally. "Thank you, Officer Collins." After Rebecca left, the energy in the room felt different, tainted somehow, like a wine that had been left open too long. Sarah wanted to explain, to apologize for her sister's obvious interest in James, but what could she say that wouldn't sound petty or jealous? "Your sister seemed enthusiastic," James finally said, settling back into his chair. "She's ambitious." Sarah chose her words carefully. "She's also very good at getting what she wants." And what does she want?" "You," Sarah thought but didn't say. Instead, she deflected. "To prove herself, I think. Being the younger sibling of someone in a specialized unit can't be easy." James studied her for a long moment, those grey-blue eyes seeming to look past her carefully constructed defenses. "And what do you want, Officer Collins?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings Sarah wasn't prepared to examine. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, her radio crackled to life. "K-9 unit, we need you at the Port of Savannah warehouse district. Possible drug shipment intercepted by customs. They're requesting Max for a full sweep." Sarah keyed her radio. "Copy that. En route." She stood, and Max immediately came to attention at her side. James rose as well, gathering his files but keeping his eyes on her face. "Duty calls," Sarah said, reaching for Max's lead. "Thank you for the interview, Detective." "James," he corrected. "And Sarah, I meant what I said last night. If you think of anything else, call me. Anytime." The drive to the port took 40 minutes through Atlanta's late-morning traffic. Sarah tried to focus on the upcoming operation, running through her mental checklist of Max's equipment and alert protocols. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the interview room, James's intense gaze, the way he'd said her name, the electric charge that seemed to exist in the air whenever they were together. And Rebecca. God, Rebecca. Her sister had always been competitive, but this felt different, more calculated, more dangerous. The port was controlled chaos when they arrived. Shipping containers stacked like enormous Legos, massive cranes swinging cargo overhead, and the sharp smell of salt water mixed with diesel fuel. A customs agent met them at the gate, leading them to a specific warehouse where a container had been flagged. "Manifest says automotive parts," the agent explained, "but the weight's wrong, and the shipping company has ties to a cartel front we've been monitoring. We need to know what we're dealing with before we crack it open." Sarah suited Max up in his working harness, checking his focus and energy level. The Malinois was vibrating with readiness, sensing the importance of the task ahead. She gave him the release command, and he went to work. Max moved along the container with methodical precision, his nose processing information Sarah could never perceive. At the rear corner he froze, the classic alert position, one paw raised, entire body rigid. "We've got something," Sarah called out. "Max is indicating drugs, probably significant quantity based on the intensity of his alert." The customs agents moved in with cutting tools, carefully opening the container under the watchful eye of armed officers. When the doors swung open, even Sarah was surprised by what they found. Bags of white powder, cocaine based on the packaging, stacked floor to ceiling, millions of dollars worth. "Holy hell," the lead agent breathed. "This is the biggest seizure we've had all year." Until, as Sarah processed Max through his post-alert routine, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Heard about the port seizure. Excellent work. This is going to break the case wide open. James." She stared at the message, a smile tugging at her lips despite her best efforts to remain professional. He'd texted her. That meant he'd gotten her number from the interview forms, which meant he'd thought about her enough to look it up, which meant another text came through, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. This one, from Rebecca. "Coffee later? We need to talk about something." The smile faded. Sarah knew her sister well enough to read the subtext. Rebecca wanted to discuss James, to stake some kind of claim or negotiate territory like they were still teenagers fighting over clothes and boys. She texted back, "On shift until 8, maybe tomorrow." Rebecca's response was immediate. "Tomorrow works. By the way, that detective is gorgeous. You must have noticed." Sarah didn't reply. Instead, she focused on Max, on the satisfaction of a job well done, on anything except the uncomfortable knot of jealousy tightening in her chest. That evening, she met James at a small coffee shop near the precinct, his suggestion ostensibly to discuss the port seizure and how the evidence tied into the warehouse case. They sat in a quiet corner booth, case files spread between them, but the conversation kept drifting away from work. "Your sister reached out to Morrison about joining the task force," James said, taking a sip of his black coffee. "She's persistent, I'll give her that." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Rebecca's always been determined. What did Morrison say? That he'd consider it, but that I'd have final say on task force composition." James leaned back, studying her. "I get the feeling there's some history there, between you two. We're sisters. History comes with the territory." Sarah wrapped both hands around her own cup, seeking warmth even though the evening was humid. "Rebecca's a good officer. If you need her skills, you should bring her on." "That's very diplomatic. And also not what I asked." James's voice was gentle but probing. "What's really going on, Sarah?" She wanted to tell him, wanted to explain the years of subtle competition, the way Rebecca had always seemed to want whatever Sarah had, the same college major until Sarah switched, the same patrol district until Sarah transferred to K9, the same friends until Sarah stopped trying to maintain separate social circles. But saying it out loud would make her sound petty and insecure. "Rebecca struggles with boundaries sometimes," Sarah finally said. "She's my little sister and I love her, but she has a pattern of getting too involved in my life." "Noted." James's hand moved across the table, not quite touching hers, but close enough that Sarah could feel the heat of his skin. "For what it's worth, I'm not particularly interested in complicated family dynamics. I prefer straightforward communication and clear intentions." "And what are your intentions, detective?" The question came out more boldly than Sarah had planned, but she was tired of dancing around the obvious attraction between them. James's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "My intentions are to solve this case," he said slowly, "and to get to know you better while I do it, assuming that's something you'd be interested in." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, the point where she could redirect, deflect, maintain professional distance, or she could be honest. "I'd be interested," she admitted quietly. James smiled, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, like a door opening onto a landscape she hadn't known existed. They talked for another hour, the case files forgotten as the conversation ranged from their childhoods to their favorite books to the small moments of beauty they'd found in difficult work. When Sarah finally stood to leave, Max rising from his position under the table, James walked her to her car. Under the glow of the parking lot lights, he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Sarah, I want to be clear about something. His voice was serious, all traces of the easy humor from inside the coffee shop gone. "I don't play games. If we're going to pursue whatever this is between us, I need you to know that I take it seriously. And if your sister's going to be an issue, she won't be," Sarah said, wishing she felt as confident as she sounded. "Rebecca and I can handle our relationship." James nodded slowly, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture so intimate it stole her breath. "I hope you're right," he murmured, "because I have a feeling this is going to be worth protecting." He stepped back before Sarah could respond, giving Max a friendly pat before heading to his own vehicle. Sarah watched him drive away, her skin still tingling where he'd touched her. Inside her car, with Max settled in his protective harness in the back seat, Sarah pulled out her phone. Rebecca had sent 3 more texts, updates about her day, a funny meme, and finally, "Still on for coffee tomorrow? I really want to hear about this detective." Sarah stared at the messages, dread pooling in her stomach. She knew her sister, knew the tone of those texts, the calculated casualness that hid sharper intentions. Rebecca wasn't just curious about James, she was circling, assessing, preparing to compete. And Sarah had no idea how to stop it without destroying what was left of their already fragile relationship. "Tomorrow," she texted back, "but let's keep it short. I have an early shift." Rebecca's response was immediate. "Perfect. Can't wait to catch up, sis." Sarah set her phone down and started the engine, catching Max's reflection in the rearview mirror. The Malinois watched her with those knowing amber eyes, and she could have sworn he understood every complicated emotion churning through her. "Just coffee with my sister," she told him. "Nothing to worry about." But as she pulled out of the parking lot and headed home through the Atlanta night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just set something irrevocable into motion, a chain reaction that would test every bond she held dear. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that coffee with Rebecca was going to change everything. The coffee shop Rebecca had chosen was deliberately intimate. Exposed brick walls, soft lighting, and quiet corners where conversations could remain private. Sarah arrived to find her sister already seated at a corner table, looking effortlessly put together in civilian clothes that somehow made her look both professional and approachable. "There's my big sister," Rebecca said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She stood to give Sarah a quick hug, and Sarah caught a whiff of expensive perfume, something new. "Thanks for making time. I know your schedule's been crazy." "The port seizure added complications," Sarah admitted, settling into the chair across from Rebecca. She'd deliberately left Max at home for this conversation, sensing she'd need her full attention, focused on navigating whatever minefield her sister had prepared. "We're coordinating with Customs, the DEA, and now James's task force. It's a lot of moving parts." "James!" Rebecca's smile sharpened. "So you're on a first-name basis with the hot FBI detective. That was fast." Sarah forced herself to remain calm, to not react to the obvious bait. "He asked me to call him James. It's not exactly groundbreaking, Beck." "No, I suppose not." Rebecca stirred her latte with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "I just think it's interesting. You've been single for, 2 years? And suddenly this guy shows up, and you're having coffee meetings and texting. How do you know about the texts?" "Because I know you, Sarah. You get this look when you're interested in someone, like you're holding your breath and waiting for something wonderful to happen." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice dropping to something that sounded almost like concern. "I just want to make sure you're being careful. Federal agents are notorious for having commitment issues. They move around, they're married to their jobs, and they have a tendency to leave broken hearts in their wake." Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee, buying time to choose her words carefully. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm 33 years old. I think I can handle my own romantic decisions." "Of course you can." Rebecca's hand reached across the table, covering Sarah's in a gesture that would have looked sisterly to anyone watching. But Sarah felt the tension in that touch, the possessiveness. "I'm just saying, maybe don't invest too much too quickly. Keep your options open." Rebecca, what is this really about? Her sister pulled back, affecting an expression of wounded innocence. What do you mean? I'm trying to look out for you. No, you're trying to stake a claim on James before I can. The words came out sharper than Sarah intended, but she was tired of dancing around the obvious. You did the same thing in high school with Marcus Chen, and in college with that guy from my criminal justice class. Every time I show interest in someone, you suddenly decide they're fascinating. That's not fair. Rebecca's voice took on an edge. Marcus and I dated for 6 months. We had a genuine connection. After you spent 3 weeks convincing me he wasn't interested in me, when he'd literally asked me to the prom. We were teenagers, Sarah. Are you really going to hold a grudge over high school drama? It's not just high school, it's a pattern. Sarah set her cup down with enough force that coffee sloshed over the rim. And I'm asking you, as my sister, to not do this with James. Please. Rebecca stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across her delicate features. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold. You don't own him, Sarah. You've had maybe 2 conversations with the guy. If he's interested in me, if we have chemistry, you can't expect me to ignore that just because you saw him first. So that's it? You're admitting you're going after him? I'm admitting that I find him attractive and interesting, and that if he asks me out, I'm not going to say no just to protect your feelings. Rebecca stood, gathering her purse with sharp, angry movements. You know what your problem is, Sarah. You've spent so much time with that dog that you've forgotten how to compete with other women. You think loyalty and dedication are enough, but sometimes you have to actually fight for what you want. She left without another word, her coffee barely touched. Sarah sat alone in the corner booth, her hands trembling with suppressed rage and hurt. Around her, the quiet murmur of other conversations continued. Couples laughing, friends gossiping, strangers finding connection over shared tables. And Sarah felt utterly, devastatingly alone. Her phone buzzed. A text from James. Task force meeting tomorrow at 1400. Morrison approved Rebecca's temporary assignment. Figured you'd want to know before the official announcement. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting the urge to scream. Of course, Rebecca had managed to get herself assigned to the task force. Now they'd be working together, orbiting around James like binary stars caught in each other's gravitational pull. She texted back, "Copy that. See you tomorrow." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of tension and barely suppressed conflict. Rebecca showed up to the task force meeting dressed in tactical gear that somehow looked more fashionable than functional, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized her delicate features. She positioned herself near James during the briefing, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated she'd done her homework on the case. Sarah watched from across the room, Max at her feet, and tried to ignore the sick feeling in her stomach. James, to his credit, maintained professional distance from both of them. But Sarah noticed the way his eyes tracked Rebecca when she moved around the room, the slight smile that tugged at his lips when she made a clever observation about the trafficking routes they were mapping. And late at night, alone in her apartment, with Max's warm body pressed against her side, Sarah wondered if she'd already lost before the real competition had even begun. The case itself was heating up. The port seizure had rattled the organization, forcing them to accelerate their timeline. Intelligence suggested a major shipment was coming through Atlanta within the week, something big enough that the cartel was willing to risk exposure to protect it. James organized a surveillance operation targeting a warehouse in the industrial district, splitting the task force into pairs for rotating shifts. Sarah's heart sank when she saw the roster. James and Rebecca on the first night shift, Sarah and Detective Marcus Chen on the second. "Is there a problem, Officer Collins?" James asked when he noticed her expression. "No, sir. Just reviewing the assignments." But there was a problem. A massive, unavoidable problem that manifested 3 nights later when Sarah arrived at the precinct early, intending to prep Max for their upcoming shift. She found James and Rebecca in the parking lot, standing close together next to James's sedan, their body language intimate in a way that made Sarah's chest constrict. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Rebecca laugh, that musical sound that had always come so easily to her sister. Saw James smile in response, saw him reach out and touch Rebecca's shoulder in a gesture that was simultaneously casual and significant. Sarah turned away before they could notice her, heading back to her car with Max at her heels. The Malinois whined softly, sensing her distress, and Sarah buried her face in his fur to hide the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm okay, boy," she whispered, "just being stupid about a guy who was never mine to begin with." But she wasn't okay. And things got worse. Over the next week, Sarah watched the flirtation between James and Rebecca blossom into something more tangible. Shared looks across briefing rooms, inside jokes that excluded everyone else, the casual touches that spoke of growing familiarity, and through it all, James maintained a strange sort of balance, still warm and engaged when he spoke with Sarah, still seeking her input on case strategy, but clearly drawn to Rebecca's lighter energy and easier charm. The breaking point came during a joint surveillance operation. Sarah and Max were positioned on the north side of the target warehouse, Rebecca and James on the south. The suspect they'd been tracking, a mid-level distributor named Carlos Mendez, had finally surfaced, and the team was preparing to move in for arrest. "All units, stand by!" James's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece. "Waiting for confirmation of package transfer before we commit." Sarah adjusted her position behind a stack of shipping pallets, Max tense and ready beside her. Through the scope of her rifle, she could see movement inside the warehouse, shapes passing in front of the few working lights, shadows that suggested at least 4 people present. "K9 unit, I need you to move to the east entrance," James continued. "We've got a possible runner route that direction. If anyone bolts, Max needs to be in position to intercept." "Copy that. Moving now." Sarah signaled Max to follow, keeping low as they navigated through the maze of containers and abandoned equipment. The east entrance was farther from her original position, putting her nearly 100 yards from where James and Rebecca were stationed. As she settled into the new position, she heard Rebecca's voice through the comm, pitched low and intimate. "You really think this is our guy, the one running the whole operation?" "No," James responded, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice. "But he'll lead us there. Sometimes you have to follow the small fish to find the shark." "That's surprisingly poetic for a federal agent." "I have hidden depths, Officer Collins. I'm starting to notice that." Sarah gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus on the warehouse entrance. Max's ears were forward, his body coiled, spring-tight, reading the tension in the air the way only a trained working dog could. Then everything went wrong at once. The warehouse door exploded outward, and Carlos Mendez burst through at a dead run. But instead of heading east toward Sarah's position, he veered south, directly toward where James and Rebecca were hidden. Sarah saw the gun in his hand before she heard James shout a warning. "Federal agents, drop the weapon!" Mendez didn't drop it. He fired 3 rapid shots that lit up the darkness like camera flashes. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw Rebecca stumble backward, saw James dive to cover her body with his own, saw the muzzle flash of return fire from James's weapon. Sarah was running before she made a conscious decision to move, Max sprinting beside her with the terrifying speed that made Belgian Malinois so effective in combat situations. She covered the 100 yards in seconds that felt like hours, weapon drawn, her training overriding the screaming terror in her mind. Mendez was down, James's rounds finding their target. But Rebecca was on the ground too, and James was kneeling over her, his hands pressed against her shoulder where blood was spreading across her tactical vest. "Officer down!" James's voice cracked with emotion, real, raw fear that Sarah had never heard from him before. "Rebecca, stay with me. You're okay. You're going to be okay." "Hurts," Rebecca gasped, her face pale in the harsh glare of the tactical lights now flooding the scene. "James, it hurts." I know. Help is coming." He looked up as Sarah skidded to a stop beside them, and his face was devastated. "She pushed me out of the way. He was aiming for center mass and she pushed me." Sarah's hands moved automatically, years of first aid training taking over. The bullet had caught Rebecca in the shoulder, missing the vest entirely. a through and through that was bleeding heavily, but didn't appear to have hit any major arteries. Still serious, still terrifying, but survivable. "Rebecca, look at me!" Sarah's voice was steady, even as her hands shook. "You're going to be fine. The bullet went through clean. Just breathe, okay? Nice and slow." "Sarah." Rebecca's eyes found hers, glazed with pain and shock. "I'm sorry. About the coffee shop. About James. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Just stay still." Sarah applied pressure to the wound, feeling warm blood seep between her fingers. "Ambulance is 2 minutes out. You're going to be okay." James hadn't moved, his hands overlapping Sarah's as they worked to stop the bleeding. And in that moment, with Rebecca's blood on both their hands, Sarah saw the truth written clearly across his face. He cared about Rebecca, maybe loved her. The way he looked at her, the terror in his eyes, the trembling in his voice, these weren't the reactions of a man who was casually flirting. These were the reactions of a man who'd just seen someone he loved nearly die. The ambulance arrived in a screaming rush of lights and sirens. Paramedics took over, loading Rebecca onto a stretcher with efficient movements, while James hovered nearby, refusing to leave her side. He climbed into the ambulance without being asked, his hand gripping Rebecca's as the doors closed. Sarah stood in the parking lot, covered in her sister's blood, and watched the ambulance disappear into the Atlanta night. Around her, the task force was securing the scene, processing evidence, documenting the shooting. Detective Chen appeared at her side, saying something about her statement, about protocol, about the administrative leave that would follow any officer-involved shooting. But Sarah barely heard him. She was staring at her blood-stained hands, replaying the moment when James had chosen to kneel beside Rebecca, when he'd shown his heart so clearly that there was no room for doubt or hope. Max pressed against her leg, whining softly. Sarah sank her fingers into his fur, anchoring herself to the one constant in her life, the one relationship that had never been complicated by jealousy or competition or impossible choices. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Let's go home." At the hospital, Sarah sat in the waiting room while doctors worked on Rebecca. Lieutenant Morrison appeared with coffee and quiet reassurances about Rebecca's prognosis. Other officers cycled through, offering support, taking statements, maintaining the thin blue line of solidarity that held them all together. James never left Rebecca's side. Through the window of the ICU, Sarah could see him sitting beside her sister's bed, holding her hand, his head bowed as if in prayer. And when Rebecca finally woke, groggy from anesthesia and pain medication, James's face transformed with relief so profound it was painful to witness. Sarah left before they could see her. She drove home through the pre-dawn streets of Atlanta, Max in his harness in the back seat, and tried to process the reality of what she'd seen. James had made his choice. Not dramatically, not with words or declarations, but in the most fundamental way possible, with his actions, his fear, his obvious love for Rebecca. And Sarah had no one to blame but herself for hoping it could have been different. At home, she stripped off her blood-stained uniform and stood under a scalding shower until the water ran cold. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a bathrobe with her hair dripping down her back, she found Max sitting in the bathroom doorway, watching her with those knowing amber eyes. "Just you and me, buddy," she told him, and her voice only broke a little. "The way it's always been, the way it should stay." Max tilted his head, then padded forward to rest his chin on her knee. Sarah buried her face in his fur and let herself cry, for the relationship that would never be, for the sister she'd lost to competition and jealousy, for the naive hope that had led her to believe she could compete with Rebecca's practiced charm. Outside her window, Atlanta was waking up to a new day, and Sarah Collins made a decision. She would do her job. She would solve this case. She would protect the city she'd sworn to serve. But she was done competing for Detective James Garrett's heart. Rebecca had won, fair or not, and Sarah would have to find a way to live with that. Rebecca's recovery took 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which Sarah threw herself into the investigation with a single-minded intensity that worried Lieutenant Morrison. and left Max exhausted from extended training sessions. She analyzed trafficking patterns, cross-referenced financial records, and built a network map of the cartel's Atlanta operations that covered an entire wall of the task force operations room. James visited Rebecca every day at the hospital and then at her apartment during recovery. He brought flowers, takeout from her favorite restaurants, and a dedication that made Sarah's chest ache every time she witnessed it. Rebecca, for her part, basked in the attention, her injury transforming from a near tragedy into something that had finally given her what she'd been chasing all along. "You should talk to him," Morrison said one evening, finding Sarah still at her desk long after the rest of the task force had gone home. Max was curled under her desk, his head resting on her boot. "About whatever's eating you. James notices, you know. He asks about you." "There's nothing to talk about, Lieutenant. I'm focused on the case." Morrison's weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy. "Sarah, I've known you since you joined this department. I've never seen you like this, working yourself to the bone, avoiding team briefings where Rebecca might be present, barely speaking to your own sister. My relationship with Rebecca is personal. Not when it affects my task force, it's not." Morrison settled into the chair across from her desk, his voice gentle but firm. "Whatever happened between you three, it needs to get resolved. We've got a major operation coming up. The intelligence you developed points to a final shipment happening within 48 hours. I need everyone on this team operating at peak efficiency, and right now, you're running on fumes and spite." Sarah looked up from the trafficking routes she'd been studying, meeting Morrison's eyes. "What do you want me to say? That I developed feelings for a federal agent who chose my sister instead? That watching them together makes me feel like I'm 17 again, competing for scraps of attention? Would that make you feel better, Lieutenant?" "No, but it might make you feel better to admit it out loud." Morrison stood, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, I think James made a mistake. Rebecca's a good officer, but you're exceptional. And any man who can't see that doesn't deserve either of you." After Morrison left, Sarah sat in the quiet operations room, surrounded by evidence of her obsessive work. The wall of connections she'd built had finally revealed the pattern. A final massive shipment coming through a private airfield outside Atlanta, large enough to supply the entire eastern seaboard for months. If they could intercept it, they'd cripple the cartel's operations and close the case that had consumed the last month of her life. She pulled out her phone, hesitating only a moment before texting James. "Found something. Major shipment incoming. We need to meet." His response came quickly. "Morrison's office. 20 minutes." When Sarah arrived with Max, she found James already there, studying the digital copies of her research on Morrison's computer. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes that suggested too many hospital visits and not enough sleep. But when he saw her, his expression brightened with what looked like genuine relief. "Sarah, this is incredible work." He gestured to the screen. "You've connected patterns that our analysts missed. This airfield, it's been dormant for years, completely off our radar. Property records show it's owned by a shell corporation with ties to the same financial network we traced from the warehouse documents." Sarah moved closer, pointing to specific nodes in her network map. "They've been playing a long game. Small shipments through the port to establish patterns, make us comfortable, but this final shipment is the real payload. Everything we've intercepted so far was just misdirection." James studied the map, and Sarah was acutely aware of how close they were standing, the familiar electricity that still sparked between them despite everything that had happened. "When?" "Tomorrow night. The flight plan is buried in private aviation records, disguised as corporate cargo. But the timing matches with increased chatter we've been monitoring, and the manifested weight is wrong for the declared cargo type. We need to move fast. Get a warrant. Coordinate with DEA and ATF, position assets without tipping our hand." James ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying stress that his controlled expression tried to hide. "Sarah, this is exceptional work. Really, I don't know how you put this together." "It's what I do." Sarah kept her voice neutral, professional. Morrison wants to brief the full task force in the morning. If we're going to hit them tomorrow night, everyone needs to be prepared. Agreed. James turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw something in his grey-blue eyes that looked almost like regret. "Sarah, we need to talk. About Rebecca, about—" "No, we don't." Sarah cut him off, unable to bear whatever explanation or apology he was about to offer. "What happened between you two is your business. We're colleagues working a case. That's all that matters." "That's not all that matters. You matter." James's voice dropped lower, intimate despite the professional setting. "I know I've handled this badly. The situation with your sister, the way I—" The door opened, and Rebecca walked in, still moving carefully because of her healing shoulder, but looking vibrant in civilian clothes that emphasized her delicate beauty. She stopped when she saw them standing close together, something sharp flashing across her face before she masked it with a smile. "Am I interrupting?" The question was light, but Sarah heard the edge underneath. "No," Sarah said firmly, stepping back from James and gathering her files. "I was just briefing Detective Garrett on tomorrow's operation. You'll get the full details at the morning briefing." She left before either of them could respond, Max at her heels, and tried to ignore the way James's gaze followed her out of the room. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Warrants secured, tactical teams briefed, equipment checked and double-checked. The task force assembled in the operations room at 1800 hours for final coordination before moving out to the airfield. Sarah stood near the back, Max at her side, and watched James lay out the operation. He was in his element, confident, commanding, breaking down the tactical approach with military precision. Rebecca sat in the front row, still officially on light duty, but insisting on being part of the takedown. "We're looking at minimal security but maximum stakes," James explained, using a laser pointer to highlight positions on the aerial photo of the airfield. "The plane is scheduled to land at 2200 hours. We'll have teams positioned here, here, and here." He indicated 3 points around the small runway, with K9 and sniper support on the elevated positions. "Once the plane lands and cargo transfer begins, we move in fast and hard. No warning, no negotiation. These people have already demonstrated willingness to use deadly force." His eyes found Sarah's across the room. "Officer Collins, you and Max will be positioned on the North Ridge. Your primary role is overwatch and interdiction if anyone attempts to flee on foot. The terrain is rough, trees, gullies, plenty of places for runners to hide. If they bolt, I'm counting on Max to track them down." "Understood," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Officer Rebecca Collins, you'll be with me in the primary assault team." Sarah saw her sister straighten, pride evident in her posture, despite the injury that should have kept her on the sidelines. Morrison frowned, but didn't object. Rebecca had been cleared by medical, even if barely. "We go in silent, we go in smart, and everyone comes home safe," James concluded. "Questions?" There were a few technical clarifications, radio check protocols, confirmation of backup response times. Then the task force dispersed to their vehicles, the nervous energy of pre-operation adrenaline filling the air. Sarah was loading Max into her tactical vehicle when James approached, his expression conflicted. "Sarah, I wanted you to know. I asked Morrison to keep Rebecca on the sidelines for this operation. She's not fully healed, and the risk—" "But he didn't listen, because Rebecca's an adult who can make her own decisions," Sarah finished. "I know. I heard the argument through his office door yesterday. I'm worried about her." James's admission was quiet, almost vulnerable. "After the shooting, seeing her like that, I can't go through that again." "Then maybe you shouldn't have let her join the task force in the first place." The words came out harsher than Sarah intended, and she saw James flinch. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair." "No, you're right. I made this complicated when it didn't need to be." James glanced toward where Rebecca was gearing up with the assault team. "I need you to know, what happened between Rebecca and me, it wasn't planned. I didn't come to Atlanta looking for a relationship, and I sure as hell didn't intend to hurt you. But you did anyway." Sarah met his eyes, letting him see the pain she'd been hiding behind professional competence. "And now we all have to live with it." So let's just focus on the operation. Make sure everyone comes home alive, and we can sort out the emotional wreckage later." She climbed into her vehicle before James could respond, Max settling into his tactical harness in the passenger seat. Through the window, she watched James walk back to his own vehicle, his shoulders tense with stress she'd helped create. The drive to the airfield took 40 minutes through increasingly rural roads. Sarah arrived at her position just after 2100 hours, a ridge overlooking the small runway, thick with Georgia pine and offering excellent sightlines for both observation and interdiction. She set up her position with practiced efficiency, rifle on its bipod, night vision and thermal optics at hand, Max in his working harness and ready for deployment. The night was warm and humid, alive with the buzz of cicadas and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Through her scope, Sarah could see the other tactical teams moving into position, dark shapes against darker backgrounds, visible only because she knew where to look. "All units, comms check." James's voice came through her earpiece. Sarah keyed her radio. "K9 unit in position, North Ridge, clear line of sight on runway and northern approach." Other units checked in, one by one. Rebecca's voice was among them, sounding strong and confident despite her recent injury. Then came the waiting. Long, tense minutes that stretched into an hour. Sarah's muscles ached from maintaining shooting position, but she stayed motionless. Max beside her equally still, both of them locked in the hunter's patience that defined their work. At 2147 hours, Sarah heard it, the distant drone of an aircraft engine growing louder. Through her night vision, she spotted the plane, a small twin-engine cargo craft approaching without running lights. "All units, target inbound." James's voice carried controlled tension. "Stand by." The plane touched down with surprising smoothness, taxiing to the far end of the runway where two vehicles were already waiting, a box truck and a black SUV. Even from her elevated position, Sarah could see the tension in the way the people moved, the nervous glances at the surrounding darkness. The cargo door opened. Men began transferring bundles from the plane to the truck, dozens of them moving with urgent efficiency. "All units, execute, execute, execute." James's command cut through the night. Everything happened at once. Tactical lights blazed to life, flooding the airfield in harsh white illumination. The assault teams surged forward from 3 directions, weapons ready, voices shouting commands in English and Spanish. Most of the suspects froze, hands raised in surrender. But 2 broke and ran, one toward the eastern tree line, another sprinting north directly towards Sarah's position. "Runner heading north," Sarah reported, already moving. "Max! Zoic!" The Malinois launched down the ridge like a missile, Sarah right behind him. The runner was fast, but Max was faster. Sarah followed the sounds of crashing brush and Max's focused breathing, her weapon ready but her trigger finger disciplined. She needed this suspect alive for interrogation. Max brought him down 30 yards into the tree line, teeth clamped on the man's leg with just enough pressure to control without causing serious injury. Sarah secured the suspect with flex cuffs, radioed his capture, and was turning to head back when she heard the gunfire, not the controlled, disciplined shots of a tactical team engaging a threat. This was wild, desperate automatic fire, someone with a machine pistol or modified weapons spraying rounds in panic. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" A voice on the radio, not James. "We have officers pinned down at the south position." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The south position, where James and Rebecca had been leading the assault team. She left the secured suspect and ran back toward the airfield, Max beside her, following the sound of continuing gunfire. Through the trees, she could see muzzle flashes, the chaos of a firefight that had gone wrong somehow. When she burst from the tree line, the scene was hell. The suspects who'd initially surrendered had been concealing weapons. Now they were barricaded behind the truck, laying down suppressing fire that had the assault team pinned behind their vehicles. And worse, far worse, Sarah spotted 2 figures caught in the open ground between the 2 positions. James and Rebecca, too far from cover to retreat, too exposed to advance, trapped in the deadly ground where no one wanted to be. Command, I need backup at the runway immediately. James's voice was tight with controlled panic. We have 2 officers exposed and under fire. Sarah assessed the situation with the cold clarity of her training. The suspects weren't aiming carefully. They were scared and spraying rounds wildly. But wildfire in a confined space was just as deadly as precise shots. James and Rebecca were both down in the dirt, using a slight depression in the ground for minimal cover, but it wouldn't be enough if the suspects decided to concentrate fire on their position. I have a shot on the primary shooter, Sarah radioed, moving to a better position. Through her scope, she could see the man behind the truck's engine block, the one with the automatic weapon wreaking the most havoc. Take it, James ordered. Sarah's world narrowed to breathing, heartbeat, the smooth trigger press she'd practiced 10,000 times. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Through the scope she saw the primary shooter drop, his weapon clattering to the pavement. It bought them seconds, but seconds weren't enough. Because now Sarah saw what James was seeing, the other gunman repositioning, taking aim at where James and Rebecca lay exposed. And there was no good angle for Sarah's rifle, no shot she could take without risking hitting friendlies in the darkness and chaos. James saw it too. Sarah watched him make a decision in real time, his body tensing for movement. He was going to try to shield Rebecca again, to cover her body with his own, the way he had during the first shooting. But before he could move, new gunfire erupted, this time from the Eastern team, finally in position to flank the suspect's barricade. The remaining gunman went down under controlled fire from multiple angles, and suddenly the night was quiet, except for the ringing in everyone's ears and the distant sound of sirens. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" James's voice cracked through the radio. "All units, situation secure. I need medical on the runway immediately." Sarah sprinted toward their position, Max at her heels. James was already up, pulling Rebecca to her feet, checking her for injuries, with hands that shook despite his training. Rebecca was pale, but appeared unharmed, her eyes wide with shock. "I'm okay," she was saying as Sarah reached them. "James, I'm okay. You don't need to—" But James wasn't listening. He pulled Rebecca into his arms, holding her so tightly that Sarah could see Rebecca wince. And in that moment, watching them together in the aftermath of nearly dying, Sarah finally accepted what she'd been denying for weeks. James loved Rebecca. Not casually, not temporarily, but deeply and completely. The kind of love that made a man willing to die to protect someone, that turned trained professionals into trembling, grateful messes when the person they loved survived danger. And Rebecca, beautiful, manipulative Rebecca, who'd spent their entire lives competing with Sarah, had finally won something Sarah couldn't take back. "Everyone else okay?" James asked, pulling away from Rebecca, but keeping one hand on her arm, as if afraid she'd disappear. His eyes found Sarah's. "You took out the primary shooter. That was an incredible shot in these conditions." "Just doing my job," Sarah managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The post-operation chaos descended. Medical personnel treating minor injuries, detectives processing arrests, evidence teams photographing and documenting the scene. The plane's cargo contained over 200 kilos of fentanyl, enough to supply a significant portion of the eastern seaboard. It was the bust they'd been working toward for months, the kind of success that would generate press conferences and commendations. But Sarah felt hollow as she loaded Max back into her vehicle. She'd done her job. She'd saved lives with that shot. She'd helped close a case that would make a real difference in her city. So why did it feel like she'd lost everything that mattered? She was pulling out of the airfield access road when her phone rang. James. Sarah almost didn't answer, but professional obligation won out over personal hurt. "Collins." "Sarah, wait. Don't leave yet. I need to talk to you." James's voice carried an urgency that made her pull over despite her instinct to keep driving. "Please, after everything that just happened, I need to— There are things I should have said before now. James, it's late, and I'm exhausted. Whatever you need to say can wait until— I'm in love with your sister." The words hit like a physical blow, even though Sarah had known them already, had seen them in every look and gesture. Hearing them spoken out loud somehow made them more real, more final. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a while now. But that doesn't change the fact that I care about you too. That what we had, what we could have had." James's voice broke slightly, and Sarah could hear the genuine anguish in it. "I never meant for this to happen. When I came to Atlanta, I wasn't looking for anything complicated. And then I met you, and you were incredible, this perfect combination of strength and compassion and intelligence. And I was drawn to that, drawn to you, but not enough." Sarah closed her eyes, one hand buried in Max's fur for comfort. "Not enough to choose me when my sister showed interest. It wasn't about choosing. Sarah, you have to understand. Rebecca needed me in a way that you didn't. She was vulnerable after the shooting, and being there for her, helping her recover. Somewhere in that process I fell in love. I didn't mean to. I tried to fight it because I knew it would hurt you, but I can't change how I feel. And what am I supposed to do with this information, James? Thank you for your honesty. Tell you that I understand and I wish you both well." The anger finally broke through Sarah's careful control. "You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed my relationship with my sister. You made me compete for your attention like we were in high school, and you let Rebecca win, because she's better at playing those games than I'll ever be. That's not fair." "None of this is fair," Sarah's voice rose. "But here's the truth, Detective Garrett. You made your choice, and now you get to live with it. So do I, and so does Rebecca. But don't call me at midnight after a dangerous operation and expect me to absolve you of guilt for choosing her over me. I don't owe you that comfort." She ended the call before James could respond, then sat in her idling vehicle for long minutes, Max's steady presence the only thing keeping her grounded. Eventually, she put the car in gear and drove home through the empty Atlanta streets, leaving the airfield and its complicated emotional wreckage behind. At home, she mechanically went through her post-operation routine: weapons cleaning, equipment check, Max's care and feeding. Only after everything was secured and Max was settled in his bed did Sarah allow herself to fall apart. She curled up on her couch with her phone, scrolling through news alerts about the successful operation. The media was already calling it one of the largest drug busts in Georgia history. Lieutenant Morrison had given a press conference praising the task force's dedication. Detective James Garrett was quoted extensively. His name and photo featured prominently. There was no mention of Officer Sarah Collins and her exceptional shot that had broken the firefight. No recognition of the intelligence work that had made the operation possible. Just another K-9 handler doing her job in the shadows, while others claimed the spotlight. Sarah set her phone aside and pulled Max up onto the couch beside her, a violation of her usual rules, but she needed the comfort of his warm, solid presence. The Malinois settled against her with a contented sigh, and Sarah pressed her face into his fur. "Just you and me, buddy," she whispered. "The way it should be, the way it's always been." Outside, the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky. Another day, another shift, another case. Life would continue. The work would continue. And Sarah Collins would do what she'd always done, put one foot in front of the other, focus on the job, and trust Max to lead her through the darkness. Even if that darkness now included watching her sister build a life with the man Sarah had wanted for herself. 3 weeks after the airfield operation, Sarah stood in Lieutenant Morrison's office, staring at the commendation on his desk, a formal certificate recognizing her exceptional marksmanship and intelligence work that had led to the successful takedown. It was beautifully printed, officially sealed, and completely meaningless. "You earned this," Morrison said, watching her with concerned eyes. "More than earned it. That shot you took saved lives, Sarah. James's life. Your sister's life. The entire operation would have been a bloodbath without your intervention." "Thank you, Lieutenant." Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless. She'd become very good at sounding professional while feeling nothing at all. "Sarah." Morrison came around his desk, his weathered face lined with genuine worry. "Talk to me. You've been different since that night. Colder, more distant. Even Max has noticed. He's been showing stress behaviors during training. That penetrated the numbness. Sarah's eyes snapped to Morrison's face. Max is fine. I would never let my personal issues affect my work with him. I know you wouldn't intentionally, but dogs are sensitive creatures, especially working dogs bonded with their handlers. Max knows something's wrong with you, even if you're trying to hide it. Morrison gestured to the chair. Sit, please. Let's talk about this. Sarah remained standing. There's nothing to talk about, sir. I'm doing my job. My performance reviews are excellent. My case clearance rate hasn't dropped. If Max is showing stress, I'll work with the K9 trainer to address it. Your sister is transferring to the DEA task force in Savannah. James Garrett is going with her. They requested assignments together. Morrison watched Sarah's face carefully as he delivered this news. Did you know? Sarah's mask cracked, just for a second, before she rebuilt it with sheer force of will. No, sir, but it makes sense. Rebecca's always wanted to work major cases, and apparently she's found someone willing to take her along. Sarah. Permission to return to patrol, Lieutenant. Max and I have shift in 30 minutes. Morrison studied her for a long moment, clearly wanting to push, to force the conversation Sarah was desperately avoiding. But finally, he nodded. Permission granted. But Sarah, when you're ready to talk about what happened between you, Rebecca, and James, my door is open. And I mean that, not as your commanding officer, but as someone who's known you for years and cares about your well-being. Understood, sir. Thank you. Sarah left before Morrison could see the tears she was fighting. She made it to the K9 area to Max's side before her careful control shattered. The Malinois immediately sensed her distress, pressing his warm body against her legs, his amber eyes full of concern and unwavering loyalty. I'm okay, boy, she lied, sinking to the floor beside him. We're okay. It's just, they're leaving, both of them, together. Max whined softly, licking her face with gentle concern. Sarah wrapped her arms around him and let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since the airfield operation. She cried for the relationship with James that had never really existed. She cried for her shattered relationship with Rebecca. Most of all, she cried for the naive woman she'd been a month ago, who'd believed that loyalty and dedication were enough to win someone's heart. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. Can we meet? I know you're angry, but we need to talk before I leave. Please, Sarah. Sarah stared at the message for a long time before responding. Fine. Your apartment. Tonight at 8. She almost cancelled 3 times during her shift, but at 7:45 she found herself pulling up outside Rebecca's apartment complex, Max in the passenger seat watching her with concerned eyes. Stay here, buddy, I'll be quick. Sarah left the windows cracked and the AC running, then headed up to Rebecca's second-floor apartment. Rebecca answered the door looking beautiful and nervous, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing casual clothes that somehow still looked elegant. The bullet wound scar was visible on her shoulder, a pink line against her pale skin that would fade but never fully disappear. Thank you for coming, Rebecca said, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. Sarah remained standing near the door, arms crossed defensively. What do you want, Beck? I want to explain. About James, about Savannah, about everything. Rebecca moved to the couch but didn't sit, clearly as uncomfortable as Sarah. I know you're angry. I know I hurt you. And I need you to understand that I never meant... Don't. Sarah's voice was sharp. Don't tell me you never meant to hurt me. You pursued James specifically because you knew I was interested in him. You've been doing this our entire lives, taking things I care about just to prove you can. That's not fair, isn't it? Marcus Chen in high school, David Rodriguez in college, that promotion to the gang unit that I'd been working toward for 2 years, and you swooped in at the last minute with connections Dad gave you. Sarah's voice rose with each example, years of suppressed resentment finally breaking free. You can't stand for me to have something you don't, Rebecca. And the worst part is that you're so good at making yourself look like the victim that no one ever sees it. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. You want to talk about victims? Try growing up in the shadow of perfect Sarah Collins, Dad's favorite, everyone's golden girl, the one who could do no wrong. Do you have any idea what it's like always being compared to you, always hearing, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" That's not my fault. No, but it affected me anyway. Rebecca's voice cracked with genuine emotion. I spent my entire childhood trying to measure up to you and failing. And yes, maybe I developed some unhealthy patterns because of it. Maybe I did chase after things you wanted just to prove I could be worthy of attention too. But James is different. Different how? Because you actually love him this time? Sarah's laugh was bitter. Or because winning him away from me felt like finally beating me at something important? Because he loves me, Rebecca shouted, and Sarah saw tears streaming down her sister's face. For once in my life, someone chose me over you, Sarah, not because I manipulated them or played games, but because when he got to know me, really know me, he fell in love with who I am. And I'm sorry that hurts you. I'm genuinely sorry, but I'm not going to apologize for being loved. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, because beneath the anger and jealousy and resentment, she could hear the truth in her sister's voice. Rebecca did love James, and James loved Rebecca, not because of manipulation or competition, but because genuine feelings had developed between them. It didn't make the pain any less, but it made it different somehow. "You're right," Sarah said quietly, her own anger draining away to leave only exhaustion. "You're right that I don't own James, that you have every right to pursue a relationship with someone you care about. But Rebecca, you have to understand that your choices have consequences. You won him, you got what you wanted, but you lost me in the process." "Sarah, don't say that. You're my sister. Nothing is more important than what? Than family." Sarah shook her head. "You proved that's not true when you pursued James, knowing how I felt about him, and I proved it's not true by resenting you for finding happiness. We're broken, Beck. Maybe we've been broken for years and just didn't want to admit it. So what? We just stopped being sisters? You're going to cut me out of your life forever because of a man?" Rebecca's voice was pleading now, desperate. "Sarah, please. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. But we can work through this. We're family." Sarah moved toward the door, unable to bear the conversation any longer. "I need time. I don't know how much time, or if I'll ever be able to look at you without feeling this hurt. But right now, I can't be around you and James together, watching you build a life while I'm still trying to process what I lost." "What about Thanksgiving? Mom is expecting both of us, and Christmas, we always spend Christmas together. Tell Mom I'm taking extra shifts. Tell her whatever you want." Sarah opened the door, pausing at the threshold. "Be happy, Rebecca, really. I hope James is everything you want him to be. I hope Savannah is amazing and your career takes off and you get the life you've always dreamed of. But I can't be part of it right now." "Sarah, please." But Sarah was already walking away, down the stairs and back to her vehicle where Max waited with faithful patience. The Malinois' tail thumped against the seat when he saw her, his entire body radiating joy at her return. "Let's go home, buddy," Sarah murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Just you and me." The drive home took her past the precinct, and Sarah found herself pulling into the parking lot even though her shift had ended hours ago. She sat in her vehicle, staring at the building where she'd spent 6 years building her career, her reputation, her identity as a K-9 officer. James's sedan was still there, parked in the visitor spot he'd claimed during his time with the task force. As Sarah watched, he emerged from the building, Rebecca at his side. They were laughing about something, Rebecca's hand resting comfortably on his arm, their body language speaking of an intimacy that came from shared experiences and genuine connection. James opened the car door for Rebecca, a small gesture of affection that made Sarah's chest ache. Before getting in, Rebecca looked up at him with such obvious love that Sarah had to look away, and when James leaned down to kiss her sister, Sarah finally accepted what she'd been fighting for weeks. They were good together. Whatever had brought them to this point, competition, manipulation, or simple chemistry, the end result was two people who genuinely cared for each other. and Sarah's hurt feelings, however valid, didn't change that reality. She waited until they drove away before heading inside. Morrison was still in his office, working late as usual. He looked up when Sarah knocked, surprise crossing his face. "Collins, everything okay? I want to request a transfer, Lieutenant." The words came out steady, certain. "There's a K-9 position opening up in the Northern District. More rural territory, different types of cases. I think Max and I need a change of scenery." Morrison set down his pen, studying her carefully. "This is about Rebecca and James. This is about me, needing to rebuild my life somewhere that doesn't constantly remind me of the last month." Sarah met his eyes squarely. "I'm a good officer, Lieutenant. I've proven that. But I can't heal if I'm constantly running into reminders of what I lost. The Northern District is still Atlanta PD. I'm not running away. I'm moving forward. And if I don't approve the transfer, if I tell you that we need you here, that your skills and experience are too valuable to lose, then I'll stay and do my job professionally. But I'm asking you, as someone who's known me for years, to understand that I need this, for my mental health, for my partnership with Max, for my future in this department." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a form from his desk drawer. "Fill this out. I'll expedite the approval. The Northern District Commander is a good man. He'll appreciate what you bring to his team." "Thank you, sir." Sarah took the form, feeling the first small stirring of something that might eventually become hope. 2 weeks later, Sarah loaded her belongings into a moving truck. The Northern District came with a small house, department housing, designated for K-9 officers who needed yard space for their partners. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a fenced yard that needed work. But it was hers and Max's, and it was far enough from the central precinct that she wouldn't constantly cross paths with ghosts of her past. Her parents helped with the move, her father's questions about Rebecca's absence carefully diplomatic. Sarah told them the truth, that she and Rebecca had experienced a falling out, that they needed distance, that she hoped time would heal the rift, but couldn't promise anything. Her mother cried, her father looked disappointed, but they respected Sarah's need for space. They promised to visit once she was settled, to bring Max his favorite treats, to be there if she needed anything. On her first day in the Northern District, Sarah reported to Commander Williams, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with kind eyes and a reputation for running a tight but fair operation. He walked her through the district's territory, introducing her to the officers who would become her new team, explaining the unique challenges of policing a more rural area with higher rates of drug trafficking through remote properties. "We're glad to have you, Officer Collins," Williams said, as they stood in the K-9 training area behind the district station. "Morrison spoke highly of your work, said you're one of the best handlers he's ever supervised." "Thank you, sir. Max and I are looking forward to the challenge." "Good, because we've got a missing person case that could use your expertise. Teenager disappeared from a hiking trail 3 days ago. Local search and rescue has been over the area twice, but the terrain is rough and the weather's been working against us. Think Max can help." Sarah looked down at her partner, who sat at attention, amber eyes fixed on her face. He was ready. He was always ready. The question was whether Sarah was ready to move forward, to throw herself back into the work that had always defined her. "We'll find them, sir," Sarah said, and meant it. The search took 6 hours. Max worked tirelessly through dense forest and steep ravines, following a scent trail that human searchers had missed. When he finally alerted near a rocky outcropping, they found the teenager, injured but alive, sheltered in a small cave where he'd taken refuge after falling and breaking his ankle. The boy's parents cried with relief. Commander Williams praised Sarah's work, and that night, alone in her new house with Max curled up on the floor beside her bed, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Satisfaction, purpose, the quiet knowledge that she'd made a difference in someone's life. Her phone buzzed with messages she'd been ignoring for days. One from Morrison, heard about the rescue, knew you'd hit the ground running. Proud of you, Collins. One from her mother. The Johnsons called to thank us for raising such a dedicated officer. Dad and I are so proud of you, sweetheart. And one from Rebecca. I saw the news about the missing teenager. That was incredible work, Sarah. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I'm proud of you too. And I'm sorry for everything. I love you." Sarah stared at that last message for a long time. Part of her wanted to respond, to begin the slow work of rebuilding a relationship with her sister. But the wound was still too fresh, the hurt still too raw. Instead, she set her phone aside and reached down to run her fingers through Max's fur. The Malinois lifted his head, regarding her with those intelligent, knowing eyes. "We did good today, didn't we, buddy?" Sarah whispered. Max's tail thumped against the floor in agreement. "We're going to be okay, just you and me. We don't need anyone else." But even as she said it, Sarah knew it wasn't entirely true. She would need people eventually, friends, maybe someday even someone to love who would choose her first, who wouldn't make her compete for attention and affection. But for now, for this moment, Max was enough. Months passed. Sarah threw herself into her work with the Northern District, building a reputation as a dedicated, skilled officer who could be counted on for the difficult cases. She and Max became fixtures at the station, the K-9 team that somehow always found the missing evidence, the lost child, the fleeing suspect. Her parents visited regularly. She made new friends among her fellow officers, people who knew nothing about James Garrett or the complicated history with her sister. Commander Williams became a mentor, recognizing in Sarah the potential for leadership and encouraging her to consider sergeant's exam. And slowly, painfully, Sarah began to heal. She didn't respond to Rebecca's occasional texts, but she stopped deleting them unread. She allowed herself to feel curious about her sister's life in Savannah, even if she wasn't ready to engage directly. And when her mother mentioned that Rebecca and James were talking about getting married, Sarah found she could acknowledge the news without feeling like her chest was caving in. Progress, she told herself. Small steps toward a future where the past didn't define her. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, 6 months after her transfer, when Sarah returned home from a long shift to find someone sitting on her porch. Even in the fading light, she recognized the silhouette. Her sister's small frame, hunched slightly as if cold despite the warm Georgia evening. Sarah sat in her vehicle for a long moment, Max watching her expectantly from the passenger seat. She could drive away, pretend she hadn't seen Rebecca, maintain the distance that had become her protection, or she could face this confrontation, whatever it brought. "Come on, boy," she finally murmured, climbing out of the vehicle. "Let's see what she wants." Rebecca stood as Sarah approached, and in the porch light, Sarah could see that her sister had been crying. Red eyes, tear-tracked cheeks, none of the careful makeup she usually wore. "Hi, Sarah," Rebecca said, her voice small and uncertain. "I know I should have called first. I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to talk to you, in person, not through texts or messages that you don't answer. How did you find my address?" Sarah climbed the porch steps, Max at her side. The Malinois regarded Rebecca with cautious interest, sensing the tension, but not perceiving any threat. "Dad gave it to me, after I promised him I wouldn't cause any trouble, that I just needed to see you." Rebecca watched Max, her expression softening. "He's gotten bigger, more muscular. The work up here must be keeping him active. Rural territory has different challenges. Lots of tracking through rough terrain." Sarah unlocked her door but didn't invite Rebecca inside. "What do you want, Beck? It's late, and I have early shift tomorrow. I want to apologize. Really apologize, not the half-hearted attempts I made before." Rebecca's voice broke slightly. "I've spent the last 6 months in Savannah trying to be happy with James, trying to build this life we talked about. And I am happy, Sarah. I love him, and he loves me, and the work is challenging and fulfilling. That's great. Congratulations." Sarah kept her voice neutral, giving nothing away. "But something's missing. Someone's missing." Rebecca's tears started flowing again. "You're missing. My sister, my best friend when we were kids, the person who knew me better than anyone. And I threw that away because I was jealous and competitive, and so desperate to prove I was worthy of attention that I hurt the one person who always had my back. Sarah felt her own eyes burning but refused to let the tears fall. You made your choice, Rebecca. You chose James over our relationship, over our family. I know, and I was wrong. Not about loving James, that's real and important to me, but wrong about how I pursued him. Wrong about dismissing your feelings. Wrong about letting our rivalry destroy something that should have been unbreakable. Rebecca took a tentative step closer. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to want a relationship with me again. But I needed you to know that I see what I did now. I understand the damage I caused, and I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. For a long moment, Sarah just stood there, watching her sister cry on her porch while Max leaned against her leg. 6 months ago, this conversation would have destroyed her. 3 months ago, she would have felt rage and bitterness. But now, standing in the life she'd built for herself, the challenging work, the respect of her commander and colleagues, the simple satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she needed to be, Sarah found she felt something different. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of understanding. Come inside, she finally said. I'll make coffee. We can talk. Rebecca's face transformed with hope. Really? Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying everything's okay or that we're suddenly best friends again. But you drove all the way from Savannah to apologize, and that means something. Sarah opened the door, Max trotting inside ahead of them. And maybe it's time for both of us to start being honest about the problems in our relationship, instead of pretending they don't exist. They sat at Sarah's small kitchen table, mugs of coffee between them, and talked. Really talked. Not the surface-level conversations that had defined their adult relationship, but deep, painful discussions about their childhood, their parents' expectations, the ways they'd both contributed to their toxic dynamic. Rebecca admitted things Sarah had suspected but never confirmed. How she'd deliberately sabotaged Sarah's relationships, how she'd manipulated situations to make herself look better by comparison, how her jealousy had poisoned almost every interaction between them for years. Sarah admitted her own failings, her tendency to dismiss Rebecca's accomplishments, her resentment of the attention their parents gave Rebecca because she was younger and seemed to need more support, her inability to see Rebecca as anything other than competition and burden. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it was honest in a way they'd never been with each other before. I don't know if we can fix this, Sarah said as dawn began to lighten the sky outside. They'd talked through the entire night, Max sleeping peacefully at Sarah's feet. I don't know if I can trust you again, or if I'll ever be able to see you with James without feeling hurt. I know. Rebecca wrapped her hands around her cold coffee mug. But maybe we can try, not to go back to how things were because that clearly wasn't healthy, but to build something new, something better. Maybe. Sarah met her sister's eyes across the table. But it has to be different this time, Beck. No more competition, no more keeping score. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, it has to be based on genuine respect and support for each other. I want that. I really do. Rebecca stood, clearly preparing to leave. At the door, she turned back. Thank you for listening, for letting me explain. That's more than I deserved. After Rebecca left, Sarah stood on her porch watching the sunrise paint the Georgia sky in shades of gold and pink. Max joined her, pressing his warm body against her legs, and Sarah reached down to scratch behind his ears. What do you think, buddy? Can we trust her? Max looked up at her with those knowing amber eyes, and Sarah smiled despite herself. The Malinois didn't judge, didn't hold grudges, didn't waste energy on resentment and bitterness. He lived fully in each moment, loyal and loving and uncomplicated in the way only dogs could be. You're right, Sarah murmured. One day at a time, one choice at a time. And if she hurts us again, we walk away for good. The months that followed brought gradual, tentative progress. Rebecca called occasionally, not often, respecting Sarah's need for space, but enough to maintain connection. She shared stories about her work, about James, about the life she was building in Savannah. And slowly, carefully, Sarah began to share stories about her own life, the cases she and Max solved, the friends she'd made, the quiet satisfaction she found in her work. They would never have the relationship they'd had as children. Too much had been broken, too many wounds had been inflicted. But they were building something new, a relationship between two adults who'd finally learned to be honest about their flaws and limitations, who'd stopped competing long enough to actually see each other. And Sarah discovered something unexpected. She was happy, not in spite of everything that had happened, but because of it. The pain had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and her relationships. The loss had pushed her to build a life that was truly her own, not defined by her sister's choices or a man's affection. She was Officer Sarah Collins, K-9 handler, skilled investigator, respected member of her community, and that identity, built on her own work and dedication, was enough. 1 year after the airfield operation, Sarah received an invitation to Rebecca and James's wedding. She stared at the elegant card for a long time, running her fingers over the embossed lettering before picking up her phone. "Beck, it's Sarah. I got your invitation. You don't have to come." Rebecca's voice was careful, trying not to pressure. "I wanted you to have it, wanted you to know you're welcome, but I understand if it's too much." Sarah looked at Max, who watched her with patient, understanding eyes. "I'll be there. Not as your maid of honor or anything dramatic, but I'll come. You're my sister, and I want to see you happy." The sound of Rebecca crying came through the phone. "Thank you, Sarah. That means everything to me." The wedding was beautiful, a small ceremony in Savannah with close friends and family. Sarah stood in the back, watching her sister marry the man they'd both loved, and felt only a gentle sadness mixed with genuine happiness. James looked at Rebecca the way everyone deserved to be looked at, like she was his entire world. And Rebecca glowed with joy that was real and unfeigned. At the reception, James found Sarah standing near the bar, watching the celebration from a comfortable distance. "Sarah, I'm glad you came." He looked older somehow, more settled. The intensity that had first attracted her softened into something gentler. "It means a lot to Rebecca. To both of us. She's my sister. Despite everything, I want her to be happy." Sarah took a sip of her wine. "You take care of her, James. She's more fragile than she seems." "I know, and I will." James hesitated, then continued. "I owe you an apology, too, for the way things happened, for not being honest with myself or either of you about my feelings. I handled it badly." "Yeah, you did." Sarah met his eyes squarely. "But we all did. Rebecca pursued you, knowing how I felt. I resented both of you instead of being honest about my hurt, and you let yourself be pulled between us instead of making a clear choice from the start. We were all messy and human and flawed. But you survived it, more than survived. Morrison tells me you're doing exceptional work in the Northern District, that you're considering the sergeant's exam. Max and I found our place." Sarah smiled, thinking of her partner waiting patiently in her climate-controlled vehicle outside the venue. "Turns out that was more important than finding a relationship. I needed to build a life I was proud of first." James nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to find someone who appreciates you exactly as you are, someone who doesn't make you compete for attention, who sees your strength as attractive rather than intimidating. You deserve that, Sarah." "Maybe. Someday." Sarah set down her empty glass. "But for now, I'm exactly where I need to be." She left the reception early, returning to her vehicle where Max greeted her with enthusiastic tail wags and wet kisses. The drive back to the Northern District took 2 hours, and Sarah spent it thinking about the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the growth, the hard-won wisdom about loyalty and love. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Thank you for coming. It meant everything." "Love you, sis." Sarah smiled and texted back. "Love you too. Be happy." And she meant it. She truly, genuinely meant it. Because Sarah had finally learned the most important lesson of all. The only person responsible for her happiness was herself. The only relationship that needed to be perfect was the one she had with Max, built on trust, dedication, and unconditional loyalty. Everything else was just pieces of a life she was still building, one choice at a time. As she pulled into her driveway and Max bounded out of the vehicle, eager to explore the yard and burn off energy from the long ride, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. The life she'd built wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she'd imagined when she first met James Garrett, but it was hers, built on her own strength, her own choices, her own determination to be more than someone's second choice or consolation prize. And that, Sarah realized as Max returned to her side with a stick in his mouth and pure joy in his amber eyes, was worth everything she'd lost along the way. "Come on, boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Let's go home." Together, they walked into the house they'd made their own, a K-9 officer and her loyal partner, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring.